We reviewed the proposed project and the CEQA categorical exemption. Okay. Just a quick overview. The applicant is requesting a vesting tentative subdivision map to subdivide an existing 4.87 acre lot into 18 legal lots of record and a 1.33 acre remainder parcel to continue supporting parking for the Sonoma Valley Hospital. The 18 newly created lots would support the development of 16 single-family residences, 2 duplex units for a total of 4 units, and 12 accessory dwelling units. The residences would have a Sonoma Craftsman architecture that would be reviewed by the Planning Commission through the design review process at a future date. And as directed by the Planning Commission, the item has been continued. We have heard some concerns and incorporated additional conditions of approval for discussion tonight.
Thank you. And David, do you have any additional comments?
Just to remind you about the W-Trans correspondence at your last commission hearing when you were discussing the Class 32 exemption, the commission asked for some information about the finesse method with application to the trips at the intersections for the AM peak, and then also wanted to have a condition that addressed conditions of approval that addressed the placement of affordable units throughout the development, and also a discussion regarding coverage, which we've included in the resolution per your direction and also in the conditions. So that concludes my comments and additions.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to just digress a little bit from the normal procedure. When we made the motion and approved the categorical exemption at our January 10th meeting, unfortunately, the motion did not include any look or revisions to the language in the resolution itself, and there were some things that needed to be corrected and adjusted or modified. So at this point, I am going to make a motion to reconsider the approval of the CEQA exemption so that we can further discuss it and handle whatever language needs to be changed and any conditions that have to be attached to it. So with that, I have the motion on the table and I'm looking for a second.
I'll second.
Okay, is there any further discussion by the commission? I will call for a roll call vote, please. Yes.
I'm sorry. You need to open the reconsideration question to the public before you take a vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we take a vote, then, does anybody from the public wish to speak on this? Seeing none, I will call for a roll call vote.
Commissioner Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner Corrado.
We're voting to approve.
Just to reconsider the item that previously.
Commissioner Willander.
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar.
Yes.
Commissioner McDonald.
Yes.
Commissioner Cribb.
Aye.
Chair Felder.
Yes.
The motion is unanimously approved.
7-0. So we will, that effectively says that at this point, my notes. The matter now may be discussed and debated as if it were on the floor for the first time. So with that, I think that if anybody has questions of staff concerning what's going on here, you may address the staff at this point. Otherwise, I will open up to the public for the public comment. Just as a preface, I should insert that we have, in making this motion to reconsider, I have sat down with the staff and we have gone through the wording of the resolution. We have attempted to address the issues that I had with that resolution, and that will be presented to this commission when we get into the, in fact, here it comes. So this is the resolution as it was presented on the 10th of January with corrections to attempt to modify the language. And again, I apologize to the commission and to the public that we're doing this kind of at the last minute, but I think it's important that we do this right, we have the process right, and so, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can just explain for the public's benefit, you may recall that direction was given at the last commission meeting to make some changes to the conditions of approval. And also, we asked your commission to get comments to us by a certain time. We were able to receive some comments from a few commissioners. We were in the process of coordinating that as we were working on the packet, which we released on Friday and also over the weekend. So it was not a problem that additional comments were coming. That's very customary once you've released the public packet for questions and answers between staff and commission. So spending time with you today and other commissioners since the last meeting up until tonight is an appropriate use of time. An additional piece of information too is that we have had some additional communication since the publication of the packet with the applicant. So this is a normal type of thing. Hopefully you try to get this stuff done way ahead of time, but that's not the nature of what we're doing here tonight.
And one of the other concerns that I didn't mention is that as part of the resolution, it had a number of instances where it referred to the conditions that were going to be placed on the resolution, and we hadn't had a chance to finalize those conditions, so it didn't seem appropriate to approve a resolution until we had the complete package of conditions specified. So that's where we are. Any questions of staff at this point?
Yes, I have a question. So, to approve this exemption, we have to make a finding that this project complies with the zoning, correct?
The general plan and the zoning, correct, yeah. That's
Correct.
one of the 4 or 5 criteria.
So, do we need to make a finding that the tentative map, which is just lots, approves or complies with the zoning, or the intended project?
The CEQA review is on the project as a whole. However, the approval that is in front of you this evening is the tentative map. So you are ultimately making findings relative to the tentative map, but again, the CEQA is on the project as a whole.
So the project as a whole, which is the ultimate built project, needs to comply with our zoning to use this exemption.
Or be conditioned to comply, yes.
When you discuss conditioned to comply, for example, the current project before us does not comply with the front setback. And so we can condition that to comply. But moving that back could affect other setbacks from other, well, we don't know because we haven't seen it. In addition to that, the side yard setbacks is up to the approval of the Planning Commission. It's a minimum of 3, but we haven't determined what that is. My last question, and I guess this is probably one of the most important, if you had to rank them, is how did you determine site coverage? What's the calculation of it?
And you're asking how, I did not personally calculate site coverage.
Well, however, how was this, because it says that it complies with site coverage, or it would have to be conditioned to comply.
Correct.
But if the site coverage is calculated the way I think it's supposed to be calculated, 14 of the 18 lots are over 40%, and 4 of them are over 60%. And so to condition that to comply is going to dramatically alter the project, and in my view, would not be consistent with our municipal code, because when it says we have to approve a vesting tentative map, it says the vesting tentative map application. So it's different. The vesting map is different than a tentative map. And so in the vesting tentative map, it says, shall include accurately drawn preliminary floor plans and architectural elevations for all buildings and structures intended to be constructed. And then the commission cannot make a finding unless it determines the intended development is consistent with the zoning regulations. And so if the site coverage calculation is that off, it's going to require completely different architectural elevations. And my question is, so I guess my first question is, how is the site coverage calculated?
I can show you the Excel file, we can pull it up.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Sorry to keep your seat. Oh, are you okay if I borrow?
Probably a better place for him.
There we go.
So as a reminder to the commission and to the public, at this point, we are attempting to go back in and look at the CEQA resolution to see whether we are willing to accept what is in that resolution. But in order to do that, I think we also want to examine the conditions for approval to make sure that everything we have requested is being specified in those conditions. And I think at some point when we get there, Christina, you also have conditions for approval that you can pass out to the,
Yes, I do.
but it's not necessary right yet, but I'm saying, I think
Okay,
that's.
so on the
that's-
screen, I'm sorry, it says you have like 60% on the screen under site coverage.
You are correct.
Okay.
So after the last hearing, we went back and worked with staff, heard all the feedback, and we're no longer debating the whole pervious, impervious item of it. We understand site coverage is the desire the planning commission wishes to proceed we heard that loud and clear. So as we discussed, and just for the record, Trent Sanson, DeNova Homes, good to see you all again here this evening. We discussed how with future design review, you are correct, Commissioner Barnett, that there would be required to be some design modifications to certain plans and architecture proposed at the design review process. So when we were looking at this, I apologize, I'm trying to, the dual screen here does not show up. And I'm glad I got my new glasses here so I don't need to squint at the screen. But I'm driving from the TV here, not off the screen here on the computer, I apologize. But the lots that were found to have the biggest challenges were lots 4, 5, 14, and 15, and that would naturally be the case with site coverage in play and any sort of a vehicular access or driveway over a lot being taken into consideration. Pervious, impervious, any driveway source being accounted into effect. So those 4 lots, in particular the ones that are right in the middle of the project where that private alley comes in and wraps around. The other 2 lots are very easy where they're plans that the footprints are just a little too large. That was 7 and 11. They're just at 44.7 and 45 based on the calculations and the direction that we've been going through the code on. So those are simple design modifications, but the other ones would require a little bit of more reworking. But to answer your question on how we calculated it, if you look at this data table here, we have everything from the total lot square footage, flat work on the lots, impervious, paved, and this was the columns from when we thought that pervious surfaces would be taken out of site coverage, but we've left those columns in here but added the numbers back in. So it includes all the flat work for driveways and vehicles, impervious, pervious, all the driveway surfaces accounted into the coverage, the ADU square footage, the total footprint of the homes, Garages are excluded, detached garages are excluded from site coverage. So for every single lot, we went through and added them all up, compared it to the lot size, and these were the 6 lots highlighted in red that currently do not comply with, without a condition. Staff has conditioned it in their staff report that we would have to comply with the site coverage requirement. So on this note, we came up with an idea for lots 4, 5. I really hate that I took this out so soon. Are they? Okay. Oh, I'm so glad that you did that. Thank you so much. Perfect. So one idea we had to eliminate that was initially when we were, before we had the discussions with staff and the planning commission, that site coverage is going to be the way of the law here on this project. The private alley was done as an easement over the lot so that there'd be more flexibility, and as I'm sure a lot of you have figured out, more of a ceiling on the FAR and the total buildable square footage for one of these lots, or any of these lots. But after looking at it further, if I probably need to bring it over here for you to see it. For the private alleyways down the middle that are currently easements, we would be happy with a condition of approval that, with a future final map, that those sections of the alleyway would become their own separate parcels, which would take it out of that whole 60%, being 20% over the 40% site coverage maximum for those 4 lots in the middle. It would reduce the ceiling for our FAR limits, and we are fine with that trade-off because we understand the concerns of it all. But we've gone through and identified those 4 lots in the middle and 7 and 11 as the ones for a future design review application. We would need to modify architecture accordingly, and think this is a reasonable solution in the middle here to make those their own parcels, still maintained by the future HOA, Homeowners Association.
I have one question before I do. I want to apologize for cutting off the chair. I just saw 60%, I just saw that on the screen. I didn't want it to go away. I was afraid it was going to go away because that was sort of my point.
We recognize it. We're not trying to hide it. That's why I wanted to bring it
So,
this evening.
I want to apologize.
No, that's fine.
And then I also want to say, ask you, Trent, you said that you removed the detached garage area, and I'm just wondering why.
That's how your code is. Detached garages are removed.
I thought it was removed only from FAR, but not from site coverage.
No, it is excluded from site coverage. I have that definition here.
Only detached. If it's attached, then yes, it is. But detached garages up to
Attached.
500 square feet.
There's an exemption.
It stays in?
Yes, attached stays.
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate you showing this. I guess my next question then would be for Veronica. So the map currently does not comply, or the architectural renderings in front of us currently do not comply, and as the applicant just stated, are going to have to be, for a few of these lots, redone. Wouldn't it be better to have have those architectural designs before us before we approve the vesting tentative map per the code?
So I think better is an interesting question. Certainly, that's an option of the commission. I do believe ultimately, however, that you can, through the conditions of approval, address what it is that has to come back to you and what it has to comply with. The purpose of that code section of saying for a vesting tentative map, we want, some jurisdictions call it a fit guide, for lack of a better word, enough information to prove essentially that the lot would be buildable. Here you have the calculations to address that issue, as well as generally the drawings. They're never, even in our own code, aren't intended to be final drawings. They're just intended to show that the project can fit on the lot as subdivided. So how much information you have versus how much you feel you need ultimately is up to the commission.
So the drawings submitted currently show that the project can't fit per the code. And so my question is, do you think this is sort of like the best practice in terms of a process for considering vesting tentative maps?
May I give our opinion on that?
No, I asked Veronica.
In terms of a best practice, I can't speak to best practice per se. Every jurisdiction has sort of a different take on this particular issue. As I said, some call it a fit list. Does it fit? Others do it by way of building envelopes to make sure that the envelope is drawn in a way that you can't exceed coverage or setbacks as long as you're inside the envelope. Some do it with just sort of preliminary box type designs. It's rare that it is, and I don't know that I know of a jurisdiction that says you have to essentially have something equivalent to final designs. Even at design review, you have a situation where you can say, well, come back and bring us back, designs that meet X, Y, or Z. So I can't really speak quote-unquote best practice. I think ultimately it's how comfortable is the commission with the information that has been provided to you relative to assuring yourselves that the project can, in fact, meet the requirements of the code with the information that you have in front of you.
But there is no doubt, though, that regardless if there are design review changes, the placement of the alleys, for example, once we approve a tentative map, those can't be changed, correct?
That is essentially correct. There's a substantial compliance standard, and I know that the city engineer is here this evening. It isn't quite as perfect as cannot be changed. If, in fact, the final map is in substantial conformance with the tentative map, and there's wiggle room there, the final map can be approved.
And all I was going to add is just for the process in doing a map and then coming back for the design review is extremely helpful to us as an applicant because we really need to know the final boundaries. Early on, there is the uncertainty for site coverage, pervious, impervious. Don't want to go back into that because we understand what the expectations are moving forward, and we know that with the conditions that are imposed or being presented to you this evening, that we can make the project can and will be compliant. But it would be extremely helpful if we had the lots and the boundaries all set and defined so that when we have the design review application, we know the bounds that we are to design redesign some of the homes within.
So Trent, are you saying that you would be submitting a different tentative map that would show separate parcels for the two driveways?
In my opinion, what the proposal is, it would be in substantial conformance, but I'm not your city staff. I'm just the applicant making the pitch on that. I am of a firm belief that would be the case, but the way I would propose it is that the Planning Commission make a condition of approval number 51, that these stubs off of Hayes and 4th Street would be their own private parcels, not over lots 4, 5,
Okay.
14, 15. Would be the simplest way in my mind so that everything can proceed.
Thank you. Other questions of staff or the applicant?
I'm not sure this is the timing is right, but it always seemed necessary for me for a project of this size and of the density that it is to have some kind of a simulated aerial oblique which places it in the neighborhood so you get a kind of a feel for how it fits, and then you have a view of aerial simulated renderings, which I think architects generate rather easily from say two oblique angles at an altitude. Otherwise, it's just very hard, unless you've been through this process yourself, to imagine what the fit is, and particularly if there are changes being made to the driveways and the lots and so forth. Is that a reasonable request at some point, perhaps now?
I would say during the design review process, we've done those specific renderings before, and we'd be happy to provide them if it would be helpful for the Planning Commission to make a decision during the design review application process. What I will say, though, is in our conceptual architect package that's been provided, we had street renderings and not photo simulations, but photo montage, if you will, of the surrounding neighborhood as it relates to the site. So we've tried to provide that in the architectural package that is here this evening. But if you would like, we've done it in Petaluma, Fairfield. We did some for the Oliva Apartments, 3D massing and everything for all of that. And do you have that?
Was there? I'm sorry. Was there something in the package that I missed that described that?
Yeah, we did a supplemental one after the fact too.
Well, okay. Not to be argumentative, but I was really suggesting, an oblique aerial shot where you get a feel for the elevations, and it's hard to. I mean, I think that straight down shot over the top of it is,
Sure.
it's kind of hard to imagine. When you have the elevations and so forth in perspective, that's a more informative thing, I
So
think.
when the discussion for the final elevations and design approvals come with that design review application, if it would be helpful for you, Commissioner Bohar, I'd be happy to provide some of those higher level.
Okay,
if that would be
thank you.
helpful for you.
Yes.
Can someone point to me, because when we discussed earlier the site coverage, that there's a 400 square foot, you remove the detached garage? You said that. Where can someone just show me where that is?
It, in the table 316, in the Central West area subdivisions of 5+ lots, under the FAR/coverage section, it says coverage is defined as maximum site coverage as a percentage of site
Got
area
it. Thank
excluding
you.
porches and detached garages.
Okay.
Any other questions of staff? I then would turn to the applicant if you would like to have an opportunity now to present anything further before we open it to the rest of the public.
Sure, and thank you, Chair Felder. Actually, everything we kind of talked about was really the essence of what I wanted to get in front of you this evening in regards to how we've looked at site coverage based on the direction from Planning Commission and working with staff. Before you this evening, there are a few different, we looked at some different options for minor tweaks that can be made or considered that we would also like to discuss this evening. I believe it's Mockingbird. No, from Trent. Here we go. So there were three options, or what I should call.
Close the window to the right.
Oh, here we go. I forgot I'm driving up here.
And close the other one.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I was driving blind here. So this is the current site plan and the tentative map as is, without any of the modifications or changes with the conditions as mentioned and discussed before with future design review. The conditions will all be illustrated and shown how they are met with that application. So example one is, as you've seen everything the past couple hearings. We prepared just an example, option 2. Where's the mouse? There you are. That showed, we heard some feedback after we were all here last, and some members of the Planning Commission met with staff and wanted to share some feedback, and one of the pieces of feedback we heard was to try to shorten the alley on the inside on both ends towards the parking lot in West MacArthur. So this was an example to show what it would look like with the ADUs and garages, if it would be desire the Planning Commission to condition the project to have this configuration for future design review. Where we flipped the ADUs to be where from this internal alley they would just pull straight in, and then similar down on the bottom end the alleyway would be shortened, but they'd turn into more of a T configuration because cars would still need access to get into the parking spaces and the garages. One thing that we did talk about with staff but did not pursue was eliminating one of the alleyways as currently drawn, because once we saw the new drafted conditions of approval, we support this condition as well and understand the reasoning behind it, but there is a condition that no trash receptacles or recycle toters or bins or anything can be placed on Hayes or 4th Street, Hayes or West MacArthur. So with that in mind, we've had some initial outreach to the local trash and refuse recycling authority, where if things aren't going to be out on the front of the street, they would like a pull through the alley to be able to pick up all their trash to be able to go all the way through. So we did not present that option this evening for that reason. And the third option was purely, I do not think this is what the neighborhood wants or what the Planning Commission wants, but just for another example to show what another alternative could be if there were no alley on the property, is here's just 18 lots fronting Hayes, 4th Street. Why do I keep losing the mouse? I'm sorry. Just with all driveway cuts on the front, and this would be completely new plans at the design review to meet the parameters of the conditions of approval for a map. But we thought still, after going through those iterations, option, or what's been already presented with option 1, so many PDFs. Option 1 is still in our mind one of the ones that is the most conducive based on the feedback we received from the neighborhood while we were going about all of our outreach early on in the process. with a condition to make these parts of the alleyway their own separate parcels, is our thought. So I'm happy to answer any further questions. No real formal presentation, but just here to help answer questions.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I have one quick question. At last meeting, you you sort of showed like the history of the iterations, and there was one plan that had an alley that had homes fronting MacArthur, and then an alley behind it, and then had another sort of batch of I think 5 parcels fronting that alley the other direction, and then I think 10 parcels to the east or the north without any alley. And I'm just curious, what was the thought process behind? Because to me, that configuration, what I'm really happy about tonight, which I hope we get to do, is discuss the site plan, because we haven't really talked about that yet, or the tentative map. And I'm just curious what the thought process in abandoning that was.
Sure, and that was definitely one of the, I think we showed 10 different concepts and examples.
Right.
But I do remember that site plan. The reason we did not do that is there were initially, as you mentioned, 5 lots that would have been facing West MacArthur. So instead of the 2 right here around on the corner here with what we proposed on the architecture, would be large wrapped porches. It just, in our experience and speaking with some neighbors, it just felt like it was going to make it very daunting and almost intimidating seeing 5 houses lined up in a row right there. Where instead of, if we turned them at an angle, set them back to where there's only 2 structures set back with large wrap porches to help soften the elements in the streetscape along West MacArthur, really helped create for just what in our mind it was a more attractive streetscape and an elevation scene for that front. So that was why we did not go that route.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, it makes sense from your perspective. I just, you know, as far as I'm speaking, and maybe we can discuss this as a commission, I actually think homes that address MacArthur, and I brought this up at the study session, is a good thing. And as long as there are no curb cuts and there's an alley behind that you can access a garage, I think that's a typical sort of plan, you know, in terms of historical development patterns. And I just personally I'm not a huge fan of, if you're going down MacArthur, you're going to see a big fence with this like dead end alley behind it. And I don't think that's typical in Sonoma development patterns. And so, while I like the alley, I wish we could have talked more about that other site plan. So that was, and I have other input on the site plan as we start to discuss it. Yeah, I mean, so the streetscape at the bottom there is what MacArthur is going to look like. And I just personally would prefer it to look more like the middle one.
Other questions for the applicant?
I had a couple, and I think something that I talked about at the last meeting, the idea or the concept of working with the hospital district on some sort of an arrangement that's not permanent, but that allows the residents and guests to use the adjoining parking lot when there's a peak in residential use, but there's a low for the hospital use, like weekends and the evenings. And so, not that I want to require it. I think that I'd like to see if it's possible, if we could maybe make an arrangement for that, not necessarily holding the hospital district to it, but having it as a condition of the vesting tentative map until such time the hospital district develops that property for a higher and better use.
So I will tell you, I did hear that feedback last week. I did reach out to the hospital leadership, and I will say the answer I was given was no, but it seems like we'll get a more detailed answer.
You know, basically, for the hospital, there's 81 spaces in that parking lot. Right now, we're using about 40 of them. We've got spare spaces, so on a short-range basis, there's spaces available. But 10 years, 12 years from now, we're facing a new earthquake deadline that may require additional building on the hospital site. If we do that and lose spaces, we really need to go ahead and make sure we're not committing to the city some spaces that we may need for 2030. Now, practically speaking, right now, the hospital does not do anything to discourage parking on that lot at night. There are no signs in the parking lot that restricts anything other than handicap spaces. And that's true of the other three lots around the hospital. If people want to use them, they're welcome to use them overnight. There are no restrictions. And there are no signs that said we'll tow your car or anything of that nature. You know, practically speaking, the spaces are available for hospital employees and patients. Hopefully, all these people will be patients of the hospital, so they all qualify.
And then just, thank you, sir. And then just to further add, and as we talked about at the last hearing, every single lot and proposed residence is overparked per the municipal code and the standards set forth by the city. And also one thing I know is we can't take it into account for the project on the parking being created, but with the deferred improvement agreement, we are assuming from the hospital, when we develop and have to complete the right-of-way sections fronting the project, over 24 new public street parking spaces are being created on 4th and Hayes. So those are extra spaces that have never been there. So those will also be added with build out for all the public.
Okay. The other question has a little bit to do with the design, and again, the last time we discussed this was, and we could take a look at this street scene too for West MacArthur. My concern has always been providing pedestrian access freely between the people that are using the subdivision and the bus stop. And my concern about no conditions added to the vesting tentative map that would preclude the property owners of lots 1 and 18 of fencing that in and not allowing people to walk through the subdivision to the bus stop. And the vesting tentative map and the conditioning of the map would be the time where you would try to make sure that happens. And neither of these scenarios really assure me that that will occur. In fact, what's happening now is the garages are being tilted in the other option, and now there's absolutely no way for anybody to get through.
So if I was one of those homeowners, and this is me personally, it would be one of the things where even though there's the vehicle access easement over the back of the lots, I wouldn't just want people constantly walking in and out every day, because that is still technically their residential lot and their private property. So in my mind, the bus stop is right here. If I was walking, I think it would only be an extra 20 or 30 paces. If I'm walking to the bus stop to come in and out and around, it wouldn't shorten my walk to the bus stop all that much. And additionally, that area is where all of our bioretention C3 basins are located. So any pedestrian connection through over that would really compromise that. And as we talked about last time, we're trying to make sure there's no issues with any of that in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for the applicant? Seeing none, I'm going to open it to the rest of the public for public comment.
Good evening, Commission and staff. Fred Allebach, 19550 8th Street East. That the that the project complies with the zoning. When I read the development code for RS zoning, it said it's intended for middle income households. And it doesn't say just the inclusionary requirement there in the RS zoning. It says middle income households. So middle income households today is exactly equivalent to the area median income, which is $68,000 for a family of 2 and $81,000 for a family of 4. You got 16 market rate units here that middle income people will never be able to afford. So it seems to me that the project doesn't comply with the zoning because of that very thing, is there's not enough middle income housing. And the Planning Commission in the study session asked, particularly Commissioner Cribb could envision that this would be a community of multiple different sizes and types of households, that it would be a village, that it wouldn't be 16 market rate houses and 2 inclusionary buildings. So I don't think that that complies with the zoning. And but the basis on that is that that this doesn't pencil out to make area median income housing or middle class housing. But there's absolutely no proof of penciling out. And so this is the kind of merits that you would want to see, is that what's the proof that it doesn't pencil out? And so I believe the developer did not choose to do a planned development which could have had a higher density and could have had more units that would fit the RS zoning. So they decided to go with this particular version, and so I don't think that's right. I think that the penciling out rationale has to be proven by a neutral party, or else it just has to be taken on faith. And what kind of merit is that if someone says, oh, it just doesn't pencil out, and you go, okay, that doesn't make sense. You have to be able to prove that, especially if it doesn't meet the development code for middle income housing. So I don't know if that argument will fly at all, but if it doesn't, I think that the 2 inclusionary units should not stay at 100 and 120% AMI, but 2 of them, one of them should be 60% AMI and one should be 80% AMI. So that would at least give a little bit of nod more to middle income people. And I'd like to find out from the developer why they didn't have a village with a little bit more variety of unit sizes and price points. And I'd also like to see the inclusionary units spread in a more equitable manner across the project. And if this is all has to be approved ahead of time, you know, it seems like I'm not sure if this is an appropriate time to be saying this, but since I'm the only member of the public, or a few, that I can maybe get a couple of extra seconds to finish up. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else from the public care to speak? Seeing no one approach, I'll bring it back to the commission. And I think at this point we have some things to go through. I'm thinking that maybe we should go through the conditions of approval, and then we should look at the site plans, but I don't, does anyone have a preference on order?
Well, I have one question and I have a suggestion.
Okay.
And this is for Trent again. Was there any, this is again about the site plan, was there any thought given to connecting Nicoli Lane with the east-west alley?
We have looked at that, but in order, we would lose lots if we reorganize things as it is right now. And under the code, a street, that alleyway is not a street, or under the code definition in the code, a street has to line up with another street. This is a private alley where no one's intended for Nicoli to drive all the way through. It's not intended to be a connection. It's just meant for the future residents to be able to access their accessory dwelling units or garages. So in our mind, from when we looked at with the traffic engineer, the city engineer, the location didn't seem to conflict with everything since it's not a street, it's a private alley. So there was a lot of discussion on that over the past 12 months.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. And then a follow-up question based on the member of the public. The dispersal of affordable units, I know that was made as a condition of approval. Is that also, like, is the commission, like, if we wanted, you know, a single family home or two to be an affordable unit, is that something we have the discretion over? To give more people the opportunity to, et cetera?
Right. To the extent that the commission wants to have that conversation with the applicant, you certainly can. And it is I'll call it a potential condition. I won't phrase it as an actual condition, because obviously, and we've talked many times over the last 12 months about the Housing Accountability Act and the question as to whether or not your conditions would operate as a denial or would operate in order to make the project overall infeasible or non-affordable. So certainly you can ask that question and have that dialogue and see where you end up with regard to that information.
But the Housing Accountability Act does not apply currently until we approve the CEQA exemption, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So my suggestion would be What I enjoyed thus far and what I would like to have more of is discussion about the map. You know, feedback, whether it was the setbacks from the parking lot or the access to the street or the alley. Like, we haven't really been involved at all in the discussion of the tentative map, like the design elements. And so what I would suggest is we continue everything, and then use tonight to really sort of discuss the map and get feedback or offer feedback, and then ultimately have a project that complies with the development code, which would make me much more comfortable as a commission and just our credibility to, approve a project that complies with the development code. Because right now we've got 4 different options that we got 10 minutes after the meeting started. None of them comply with site coverage currently and with the front setback. At our first meeting in December, we were told everything was perfect. There are rules of the road, and we're following the rules of the road, and everything is perfect, and this should be approved right now. And every iteration, we've discovered that no, not everything was perfect. And so it would make me more comfortable, and it would make me more comfortable as a planning commission to approve a vesting tentative map, which again has a higher level of scrutiny than a tentative map, that complies with the code. Because this exemption, as I've discussed, is fairly unprecedented in Sonoma for a project of this scale and size. We've debated the urbanized area. I don't want to even go there. Let's say that applies. One of the requirements is that it follows the code, and the current map, in my view, doesn't. And I understand while there are conditions, it would just make me more comfortable to have a map that was all buttoned up and we could approve that and everything all at once. And because we've had this discussion so much, we haven't really discussed the map and, all of the issues with that. And so that's what I would suggest.
So my question is, are you saying that you don't want to discuss the the CEQA exemption? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that to qualify for an exemption, it has to follow the code. And so we are in a way discussing it. By discussing the map and making sure it all follows the code, we are discussing that exemption. And I would just suggest that we continue everything, and then when everything's buttoned up, we approve the exemption if the commission wants to, and the map all at once.
You mean when the new commission is seated?
Well, 5 of us will be here,
Okay.
and we have a new commissioner tonight.
And you don't think that we're prepared to discuss the exemption when the facts are clearly in support of it?
You think they are?
Yes, I do.
Which one? I mean, in my view, it doesn't comply with the code, and I think that's a major issue.
Traffic is not an issue.
I didn't bring that up.
No, but that is certainly not an issue. The fact is that the traffic report says that it is within the guidelines, and to say Andrux is part of the situation when it's only a block away, I would go with the facts that are presented on that. The flooding isn't an issue. And the site coverage, we're discussing that, and to me that's the only issue that needs to be resolved. And I think we can come to a resolution within the next hour on whether the site coverage is going to be resolved, and I believe that we have the ability to say this is an exemption to the CEQA.
So you think that this is a good process? We have 4 different options. None of them comply with the code. You feel like we can just condition everything away, or do you want to create perhaps a better precedent moving forward?
Maybe I can share some of my concerns about compliance with the development code. I see both perspectives, but I also am looking at the overall process, and I don't think anybody wants to set a bad precedent where we're we need to create like one consistent way of looking at vested maps moving forward. And at this point, I don't feel that the development code is being met, and I have concerns about the design with respect to the front yard setbacks of the lots, with respect to side yard setbacks, which clearly none of the options comply with. And our commission has the ability to select and identify what that side yard setback is. And frankly, I would want to see what the box configuration of these houses are going to be before we approve a map. So I'd like to see how this would all work out with the appropriate side yard setback that we determine and the front yard setback. Additionally, I have concerns about the setback between the parking lot and this future development. And again, under the development code, we have the ability to create a greater setback than what's being proposed, which is 5 feet. And I think we should have those discussions and then see a map or a plot map that corresponds to what we all agree in a consensus form. And I think that's a better approach at doing it, instead of trying to condition it and then, you know, then maybe it coming back and say we couldn't make this all work out. I'd rather like spend all this time and effort, like I started in December. It's like, let's just have a discussion of the map and like figure out what we want to see, and then have a project move forward as a vesting tentative map along with the environmental exemption, so we all feel comfortable. So that's I think that's what Kelso is trying to get at, and I think that there's some logic and it makes sense.
I agree with what you're saying about the map, and I think we really need to go through that tonight. But I do not agree that we have to belabor the CEQA exemption. I believe that that has been resolved.
Well, it's like a chicken and egg thing. It's like you have to have it comply with the development code before you exempt it, and then we've got nothing that we have.
That
shows
is
that
true, Linda. It has to comply with the code to grant the exemption.
Okay, so where exactly does it not comply with the code?
With coverage,
Well,
with
it's
side
an
yard
Excel
setbacks,
spreadsheet.
with front yard setbacks, and I mean, that's pretty basic zoning stuff.
All right, so the three things that don't comply with the code are the coverage and the setbacks. And what is the other?
Well, one thing
Those are
that we do have the
fundamental.
discretion, as even as a part of a vesting tentative map, is to make changes and nuances such as improving pedestrian circulation, looking at parking, looking at increased landscaped areas, maybe even working with the developer on like creating open space that's private for the development, which that's something we haven't even gone in and discussed, you know, that kind of stuff. Just the basic stuff that you talk about as part of a subdivision design, that, you know, there's open space elements, there's circulation elements, there's our parking code. I know we meet the parking code, but there might be ways to improve it for guest parking.
Okay, so let's discuss coverage. Why don't we have the discussion right now and resolve the issue of coverage?
Well, it's so. For example, if we were to increase side yard setbacks and maybe make additional, more generous setbacks along the lots that front the parking lot, and then we also increase or make changes to the front yard setbacks of all the developments, what would be the building pad? And then would that be something that would be acceptable to the developer, or would they may come back and say, look, we can't make this work. We really want to do A, B, and C. And then, so by not knowing that, it could create problems. But then also to the point of other people and members of the public, and also our own commission, I'm still not satisfied, and I still don't understand how we're going to disperse the affordable housing. I'd like to really see that works. I want to make sure that that housing is acceptable to me and to the people that are going to live in those units, and I want to make sure that that it works.
Yeah, but let's stick with one issue. Let's really dig into coverage, okay? And I agree with you about the dispersal, but let's leave that. But let's stick with the coverage and get focused and stay on that and resolve it.
So I think what Commissioner McDonald is trying to say is it can't really be resolved. I mean, we can we can make an interpretation, but we need to see what it looks like. We don't, we don't have an architect here to redo it. And ultimately, I think the greater point, which is why I'm sort of mystified by your approach, is that this project is going to be here for 100 years. I mean, people are going to be living here, generations from now. And so what is the problem with taking a few more weeks or month to just button it up, create a good precedent, and get it right? I don't understand.
Well, I'm kind of mystified, though. What is the problem with 10-foot, 4-foot, 5 setback? I mean, I don't see that's, or why does the front yard setbacks have to be? They're 20 feet, 23 feet? I mean, it's...
They have to average 25,
25,
and
right.
They're 23 right now.
Yeah.
So, meaning per the exemption, which is a huge...
But we have a condition of approval that would change that.
But that starts moving everything around on the map, these building envelopes that we haven't even seen.
Do we want to, as a commission, accept a 5-foot setback for all these houses, or do you think that they're right now the planning commission is to consider a 25-foot average setback between side yards? I believe that's what the development code says. I don't know if that's even possible, but
For the front setback, it's an average of 25 feet. Is that what you're saying?
the side yard setback average
Is a minimum of 3 feet as approved by the Planning Commission?
is a minimum of 3 feet. There's no average side yard setback?
No, there's not.
Okay, not in the RS.
Yeah,
But that's an interesting one because we can determine what that is.
Right, and we still haven't talked about
Right.
what sort of standard we want for the subdivision, so.
So let's, not to interrupt, but I want to be clear that you can determine what it is, but you cannot determine what it is in a way that renders the project infeasible. So as an objective standard, you have a minimum of 3. That's appropriate. You can address 3 if you say 3 6 inches. That probably does not render the project non-buildable or infeasible. If you were to say it has to be 75 feet, then obviously that would render the project infeasible for the number of units that are proposed.
So okay, so I understand, but let's say we did 10 feet or 15 feet from the parking lot.
Well, you'd have to,
Or an average of 15 feet.
Yeah, let me just continue with that. So that may render those lots that border the parking lot unbuildable for duplexes. Perhaps it wouldn't, perhaps it would. But what I'm saying is, so we have 18 lots. You could create 16 lots and then do 4 duplexes, and you'd still have the same density, correct?
well, again, whether that would render the project as a whole infeasible is something you have to speak to the applicant about.
But how do we determine that?
Well, the burden of proof is on the city, unfortunately, in that circumstance, to prove that it would not render it infeasible. So under those circumstances, the applicant has the ability to come forward, give you the information. You have to weigh that information, and in order to address that information, if you don't believe it, we would have to come back with our own financial analysis to make a determination as to whether or not that would render the project infeasible, which is a possibility, but it would be something that we would have to come back to do.
Mr. Chair, if I can just interject one comment to respond to Commissioner McDonald. We did provide in your staff packet a condition number 20 that deals with open space or parkland dedication, basically the Quimby stuff that's in the municipal code. I think it's condition number 20. I believe it's condition number 20 that does address that particular issue. In our municipal code, it does say that for projects less than 50 units, in lieu fees are the only basis on which we can address Quimby. So we have actually provided that condition. That's a new condition. And the applicant has agreed with that condition.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know. I mean, I look at the number of units here. You look at the size. I mean, to get the additional 2 feet setback, I mean, you're not talking that much from a 2,000 square foot. You know, it seems to me we're talking about like immaterial little things. I mean, if we're looking for a way to not build housing, then we can nitpick this to death. If we're looking for a way to get housing built, then we can say we have conditions of approval that address this to code, that are going to deal with the site coverage, assuming now the applicant, you know, they can choose and say it's not going to pencil out for them to have to meet that increased setback. But that's, to me, that's their decision to make. If we're basically conditioning it to comply, I don't know why we you know, need this level of specificity that you're asking for. I mean, because it seems to me overall on a project of this scale, we're talking about relatively small or minor changes. We're not talking about like huge differences. And I, you know, if 3 foot is the standard for side yard setbacks, and I see everything from, you know, 4.5 feet to 10 feet, then I think that seems well within the realm of 3 foot side yards setbacks. We're 2 feet difference on the front yard setback, which is addressed. We're off by a few percentage points on a few of the lots for the coverage. So, I mean, we're talking about taking out, I don't know, my math isn't that good, maybe 1,000 square feet, I don't know, 1,500 square feet of total building space over the breadth of the project. That's not that big of a change. I don't know that, it doesn't seem to me hard to imagine that kind of change on a project of this dimension. So I just believe like we're quibbling about little tiny things that are slowing down providing housing, which we need. And yes, it's going to be here for hopefully 100 or more years. But we're also, I mean, in the end, these little finite differences, it feels like that we're talking about, at least aren't material to the overall approval of the site plan and the map. So that's just my 2 cents.
It looks to me like we have 2 paths we can go down. Either we take a path that says the tentative map has to completely comply with the code, and then we are able to approve the CEQA exemption and the map and move on with the project. Or we can say the tentative map is close to matching code, but there are some discrepancies, and we can come up with a list of conditions that take care of those discrepancies. Right now we have a list of conditions that until tonight numbered 50. I think we just added a 51st. That's a lot of conditions. And granted that most of those don't affect what takes place with the map, but it's setting a precedent of whether we want to get the map right and then approve the project, or we want to approve the map and then fix it with design review. And that's what this commission has to decide is the right way to go.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I do want to point out some restrictions from the Housing Accountability Act just for the commission's edification and consideration. We've talked a bit about the requirements relative to disapproving a housing development and what one has to do to make that determination. When the housing development includes affordable housing, those findings are further restricted. So you have to, by a preponderance of the evidence in the record, determine one of the following. Obviously, we've talked previously about a specific adverse impact upon public health and safety, and there's no feasible method to mitigate that impact, and the description of what that is. The denial or imposition of conditions is required in order to comply with state or federal law, and there is no feasible way without rendering their development unaffordable or infeasible to address that state or federal law. If the project is proposed on land zoned for agricultural resource preservation. Finally, under subsection 5 of that section, the housing development project is inconsistent with both the jurisdiction zoning ordinance and general plan land use designation as specified in any element of the general plan as it existed on the date the application was deemed complete. And the jurisdiction has adopted a revised housing element in accordance with state law that is in substantial conformance with the article. However, there's a qualifier. This paragraph cannot be utilized to disapprove or conditionally approve a housing development project if the housing development project is proposed on a site that is identified as suitable or available for very low or moderate income households in the jurisdiction's housing element and is consistent with the density specified in the housing element, even though it is inconsistent with both the zoning ordinance and the general plan land use designation. So you have additional limitations under the law because this is a housing element site.
I have some concerns about the cumulative effect of these development code compliance issues that we're talking about here, in that we haven't seen the completed project. We don't know what the total impact of that's going to be, and there's been discussion of the fact that it may come back to us to review and revise. And I take this CEQA exemption issue very seriously, and I think it ought, accepting the criteria of that it meets the development code, I think is a really an important decision that the commission makes. And for that reason, I'm real concerned, frankly, about the commission setting a precedent for not being strictly adherent to the rules that I just talked about. That's a major issue, and I think the authority and dignity of the commission ought to be upheld in that regard for my thinking, for that sole reason. There are other reasons, I think. And I would be inclined to agree with Commissioner McDonald's narrative about how those issues may be cumulative and add. And I'd be inclined to support the continuance idea for that reason.
What the city attorney just read, I think, also backs up the approach to continue it. Because once this CEQA exemption is approved, the Housing Accountability Act is triggered, and our hands are further tied. And so I think the best course of action for this project, for this commission, and for Sonoma is to get the map right, get the project right. We really haven't even talked about the map yet. And then approve everything all at once. And remember, I'm not a huge fan of the exemption to begin with, but I'm willing to approve an exemption if it complies with the code. And in my view, a CEQA exemption is a huge ask because it takes it out of the CEQA process. It takes away the rights of the public to, the legal standard is completely different with an exemption than with the initial study process. And so that is a huge gift, the exemption. And the Vesting Tentative Map is a huge gift as compared to the traditional tentative map. And so with those gifts comes, with the Vesting Tentative Map, you have to provide a map that meets all the zoning code for the project you want to build. With the exemption, you have to comply with everything in the code. And it doesn't for either of these. And so if this was an initial study process, if this was another process, it would be different. But I think we would be creating a bad precedent. And I think what we could do is continue the item, figure everything out tonight. They could come back with a map that fits everything we've discussed, and we could satisfy moving housing along, and creating and establishing a good precedent for the Planning Commission. Because again, I have to say, in December we were told everything's perfect, and that's was not the case. And so forgive me for not being completely confident in the fact that everything is currently perfect.
Could I interject for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make a comment that I think that this project is a little bit of an anomaly based on the timing that the application was submitted and on how this whole process has unfolded. I understand all of your concerns about site coverage, and I have many of the same concerns myself, and moving forward and making sure that we get a process correct. This particular applicant is a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place, and I just want to take a moment to remind everybody about the timing of all these conversations about coverage and site coverage. So when this application originally came before the Planning Commission last January, all of the conversations were about coverage, not site coverage. They went forward through their development process internally based on the direction from this Planning Commission last January, on the understanding that the standard they were being held to was coverage. And they submitted their application in April. That was prior to the discussions at the City Council level about using site coverage versus coverage. So this issue about using site coverage for them came about the time that their application was being deemed complete. They, in my experience and everything I've seen in the record, they have done nothing but make a good faith effort to try to comply. This is not the only project that has been going down the route of looking at using pervious surface or pervious pavers. Based on what I've been able to see, that was direction that was given by the previous planning director and previous staff, that might be a way for these projects that were kind of caught in between this discussion. I don't believe there's anything going on disingenuous with the calculations. They are switching gears midway. As I'm sure you understand, the development project process is very expensive and very time intensive, and so they went pretty far down the process with information coming from the director and staff and the Planning Commission that coverage was what they were going to be using. So while I agree with so many of your concerns, I feel that this project is somewhat unique and that it justifies using the condition of approval approach. I don't know that moving forward that's what we want to do. We want to clean up the code and make sure that the rules are very clear so that everybody knows what the rules are moving forward. But I do think that the timing and these unique circumstances warrant going the route of using the conditions of approval.
Well, I appreciate that. At the study session, we never really got into like the details of like coverage versus site coverage. We were just sort of talking very high level. In addition, we had 16 lots. They've added 2 lots, which has exacerbated the site coverage issue and sort of brought it to the fore. So I don't think it's fair to say that. Additionally, I think while I understand the unique process, I'm of the view that doesn't really matter, unfortunately. I think again, they're asking for an exemption, and they're asking for these very unique, in my view, points of precedent in Sonoma, and so I think we have to consider that. And in my view, I think that we could have a discussion tonight and make this map better and give some direction on this map that we've yet to discuss. And I think this could be approved very quickly. And so, you know, while I appreciate that timeline, I mean, I don't think that we should sort of, you know, change sort of the proper procedure just because of that timeline. And again, it's not, I mean, that's just my view.
Couple comments. First, in terms of what we're seeking for the exemption, if I could summarize, we're talking about coverage, we're talking about front yard setback, as well as side setback, correct? And regarding the conditions right now that are in their 50s, in reviewing them, it looked like a lot of them were boilerplate conditions. So if you were to discard, or I shouldn't say discard, if you were to put the boilerplate conditions to one side and just call out those conditions that are specific to this proposed site plan, it isn't overly buried with conditions, is it?
I guess you're in the number of about a half a dozen to a dozen that are custom fit.
So one thought is, and again, whether it's feasible this evening, is to go ahead and have this discussion regarding the site plan and get to the point where maybe one route would be that we could add some additional tailored conditions that might definitively address some of our current concerns. I certainly would be open to that as far as the discussion aspect of it and whether we could actually get to some point where we could add conditions where we all feel comfortable. I'm not sure.
Well, maybe it's appropriate, Christina, to pass out the conditions that you've worked up. Staff has made some attempts to take into account the comments from the commissioners, and I met with the staff today, and we attempted to go through, and at least if we went the route of using conditions as the way to approach this project, to try to clean up the conditions so that they would satisfy the majority of the commission. The items that are most specifically addressing our concerns are condition number 2, condition number 14, I think those are really the two conditions that really address the concerns we had in terms of site coverage, in terms of dispersal of affordable units. So it's a question of whether this commission feels that it's sufficient to use these conditions to handle in design review what the map seems to be lacking at this point. But it's up to this commission to make that decision.
I mean, I just think it's bad precedent in general, and this is not about this project, it's about the entire process, that we have these corrected conditions in the middle of the meeting. And this is not a criticism of staff, it's just we are being sort of asked to rush this through right now. And, none of this has been online. The public's right to public information has been completely eliminated. And I just think this is a bad process. And I think we have everything here, we can figure it out, and then through a good process, basically approve it at the next meeting with all of our input.
I have some questions of the applicant. Okay, let's get down to one of my big concerns, the dispersal of affordable housing. Right now, the plan that's shown is not acceptable to me. I don't know if it's acceptable to many members of the public and maybe some of my commissioners. What is your proposal for dispersal of units, and what would that look like? And have you thought through that?
What would you like to see? So I don't spin myself in circles.
Well, I was hoping that you might have thought through
I
that
have.
between. Okay, so what are your thoughts?
I
have my own thoughts, but
So if for further dispersal, I could see it going where lots 9 or 10 would remain as is where they are. And then I could see one of those ones swapping places with, say, for example, lots 14 or 5. And then slightly, whatever one is rotated to another location would be slightly, the lot line would be slightly shifted over so that a duplex could be accommodated on a lot in a different location.
and what would those side yard setbacks be and front yard setbacks be?
25-foot front average. That was admittedly an error on our end.
But
where we were off
I know, but
25
what would the setback be for lots? I can't see. For lots 5 and lots 14. What would the front yard setback be for both of those if a duplex were there?
The average across the project would be 25.
I know,
And
but
we would-
what
and then we would- and
but
then
for
we would
this
have a 5
for this
side setback
specific
like we have
duplex
here.
plan, would it be 24 or?
I would still stick with a 30-foot front setback for the duplex because the way it's currently designed with the garage and the setback, that's still a very large 30-foot distance for a rear yard between the parking and the main unit. But if it would be at your discretion to see the duplex or workforce housing unit set closer to the fronts, and then another unit has to be set back farther to maintain that 25-foot average, I'm open to that.
And so what would remain then on lots 9 and 10? What plan?
So just in theory, let's just say lot 9 would stay where it is. We would move the duplex on lot 10 to lot 14, slightly shift the boundaries of those lots over a little bit, and basically flip-flop lots 14 and 10.
What would you consider the side yard setbacks for lots 9 and 10 after, say, for example, that occurred?
I would say that the setbacks as they're shown over the 3 foot would remain the same.
Okay. And if you were to take a cross section between, say, for example, the berm that was required as part of the lot development for parking, and what would you consider a cross section between lots 9 and the parking lot after that was to take place? And how would you create, because this all has to do with my understanding of approving lot 9, making sure that that lot doesn't have to change, or the floor plate or the building pad. I just want to understand, and this is not, I want to understand how, in your mind's eye, how you would do that. Because right now I'm having concerns with the setback for lots 9 and lots 10. I'd like to see an increase for at least the setback between the dwelling unit and the parking lot. And particularly lot 9, I'm concerned about the berm, because right now we don't really have any details about how that berm transcends between the parking lot and that new lot 9. So I know that you probably will eventually work that out, but I want to understand if there was a setback between a structure and that lot, how that would pan out.
Who's smarter than me ish.
Okay, thanks.
I'll just speak to the berm real quick. Ryan Hansen with CBG. On sheet 3, you can see there's a little bit of grading. You're correct. There's a berm. If we were to send that berm into, say, that wall right now, right, it would be up and then it would be cut off. To eliminate having a 3 or 4 or 5 foot wall because of that high berm, that's where you can see there's a little bit of grading on sheet 3 where we would transition that berm down so that that pad only sees a 1 to 2 foot wall with the fence on top of it. And in fact, that lot 9, and these grades are a little bit hard to see on here, that lot 9 is pretty much equal with that parking lot. So there's no scenario where there's going to be cars looking into that lot, if that is one of your concerns.
Would you say it's fair that at a minimum that would be a condition of approval that our commission, as we go forward with the design, to look at a cross section and look how that berm is shaved down to see if it creates some sort of more of an impact? Because I do know the neighbors wanted that berm for screening of that parking lot. And then additionally, would you feel that it would be in our commission's purview to know that that berm is not creating any sort of privacy impacts to people, in the parking lot, to the houses that are being proposed on lots 9 and 10? Because I think what I'm getting at is I think that there should be an increased setback between the parking lot, and particularly on lot 9 because of the unusual circumstances of the way the parking lot's configured.
So aside from whether they're workforce affordable housing units or market rate units, the way we look at land planning is it's how things impact the neighboring properties, which is why the parking lot was planned the way it was, because there was surrounding development around it already. So the hospital had to take into account the neighborhood while they planned and developed their parking lot. The existing condition of the parking lot should not dictate what we do on the property. If you really don't want to see and you think it's discriminatory to put the workforce housing units next to the parking lot, I'll move them elsewhere. But I'll defer to Deb on that subject because she works with it.
It's not that the workforce housing is next to the parking lot. The thing is that whether or not, as a commission, we think that having them all in one part of the development is the best solution. But what I'm getting at has nothing to do whether there's a duplex there or not. My concern has to do with how much the building is set back from the parking lot, and making sure that whatever we build, if we build a structure on lots 9 or 10, whether it's a duplex or a single family home, there's a setback that is commensurate with the fact that there is a screen berm that is raised fairly high up, and I want to make sure that that doesn't cause a conflict with the design of that whatever's built, whether it's a duplex, single family home, a garage, whatever. A garage is not important, but I'm more concerned about the compatibility of that raised berm to ultimately what we build. And so in my mind's eye, the greater the setback between the house and that berm improves that person's privacy and security. To have I don't know what the height of the berm is, so we've never seen a section. So if you have a 7-foot high berm next to your property line and the house is set back 4 feet, that could be considered something of an oddity and needs to be addressed before we approve the vesting map.
Valid points, and just to try to paint this picture, the berm is at obviously the front of Lot 9.
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at a challenge of softening that berm, but also not taking too much away, because it is serving a purpose for those parking stalls across the street to Hayes. So we don't want to just eliminate it and flatten it.
Mm-hmm.
One point as far as the elevation, the top of the berm is essentially 73. Our pads or finished floors are 71 almost. So it's really only 2 feet higher. Now, it's high relative to the parking lot above, but because of our grades on our side and we start to raise up to the north, when you put a 6-foot good neighbor fence along that, you won't even see that berm unless you were standing on top of the fence. So there's no obstruction that we would expect from the berm relative to Lot 9.
So you're saying that the final grade of lots 9 and lots 10 are significantly higher than the elevation of the parking lot itself?
No, I mean, significantly is a relative term. It's 2 feet or so. So if you have a 4-foot berm and then we happen to come up 2 feet, that's where you get that 2-foot difference.
Okay. And then this might be a question for staff or maybe the applicant. If we are to look at another option, which is taking portions of those private streets and actually creating separate lots, and then I would assume putting an easement over those lots, what is the subdivision requirements for those types of parcels that are created? Because my understanding is there's no minimum width for a parcel, but if we're actually creating a lot that's not usable, what do we need to know as a planning commission if we were to create those lots?
So typically what would happen under those circumstances is that the lots are created as part of, and it would probably be a lot, not lots plural, so that lot would be created as part of the subdivision itself. That lot would be restricted to use as for this purpose by the conditions, because that's the purpose you're approving it for. The lot is owned and maintained by the homeowners association. It's essentially a common area parcel. This is a common interest development. It becomes a common area parcel maintained and owned by the homeowners association.
So those parcels would be conditioned and easements would be created, so there could not be any right of the homeowners association to sell those off separately in the
Correct.
future.
That's
Okay.
correct. They're restricted from doing that.
Okay. And then this is a question for the applicant. Right now we have setbacks, side yard setbacks that range from 4.5 feet to anywhere to 11. But if there was a consensus of the commission to increase side yard setbacks to maybe 5 to 7 feet, and look at each one of those lots on a case-by-case basis with the objective of making sure that this subdivision is consistent with the land use patterns that surround it, which if I were to take a look at the lots along Hayes Street and those on 4th Street, those homes have greater side yard setbacks in many cases than what's being proposed. But if we were at our discretion, come back as a commission and talk about possibly greater side yard setbacks, would that, in your mind, cause major problems with coming back to us through design review and developing plans that you would consider developable and sellable, and that you would render the subdivision still useful?
So I wish we had some dimensions for the homes on Hayes, but it really does look like they have 3 foot and 5 foot for 8 foot to 10 foot aggregate side yard setback where both sides are combined. When we were looking at the development code where it said a 3 foot minimum, of course at the discretion of the planning commission, from a livability standpoint, we didn't think 3 foot was enough, so that's why we proposed it's pretty much, let's call it 5 foot across the board, depending on the various plan types where there might be some pop out architectural features where it makes it 4.3 in some spaces. I think going over 5 foot for a 10-foot aggregate side yard setback makes it starts to get a little bit too constricting. But if I could definitely live with 5 foot minimum, both sides 10-foot aggregate, something like that. Less
At a minimum.
At a
Combined.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'd
Okay.
just like to note that it's a different zoning district, and on the projects, the properties completely surrounding the project, they are low-density residential, where this project is residential Sonoma, so different standards apply.
Right. Well, there are different standards, but it's very clear in the code that our planning commission sets the standard for the subdivision. So we have to figure out what that is before we approve anything. So,
Can I speak to that point for just a
Yes.
moment? So what I've not heard is anything where we've not met an objective standard. What I'm hearing is that you have issues related to that 3-foot minimum at the discretion of the planning commission beyond that. And so what we're doing is we're proposing a project that meets the code. And there were only 2 conditions that I believe needed to be added. One related to the front yard setbacks, the 23 versus 25. That condition has been added. We're fine with that to achieve the 25-foot average. And the other is the coverage issue, which Christina spoke to. What you're talking about now is us coming back and perhaps at design review, the planning commission having some flexibility to talk with us at that point about what the side yard would look like. And we're fine with having that conversation at design review. But we have met every objective standard in the code as this project is currently conditioned. And so we believe we're entitled to the CEQA exemption. And so I think that is the first question before the planning commission, because if this project is exempt, then just as you did at the last meeting, you decide that issue first, and then we move on to the tentative map. We seem to be going in reverse.
no, can I interrupt you? I specifically asked your associate whether or not, if we were in the future to ask for at least a minimum 10-foot or maybe greater side yard setbacks, whether that would render the project infeasible. And what I heard from him saying, no, I think we can work with that. That's very important to me to know before I approve this map, because what I don't want to do is to go through design review and have your project you say, we can't do that. We have to have 3 feet. Otherwise, we can't build houses there. But I think you answered my question. But I have the right to ask that question, okay?
I
As a
understand.
commissioner, before we approve something and before we go through another process.
What I guess I'm telling you is, as proposed, what Trent is saying to you tonight is the map as proposed is buildable by meeting all objective standards in your code.
Except one objective standard, which is the side yard setback, which is something under our purview. And I think that question has been answered. So, but thank you. I mean, that is not an objective.
And
That is a discretionary standard on our part.
And it's discussed earlier.
Minimum 3, but at our discretion,
Right.
more.
And once we approve that exemption due to the Housing Accountability Act, our hands are tied.
Exactly.
And so it would be nice to see a map, as I'm sort of on repeat here, that was perfect, and then we could approve the exemption, and then we could approve the vesting tentative map, which is different. It's not a tentative map, it's a vesting tentative map, which has certain requirements.
And what we're telling you is that the map as proposed, with the 2 conditions to address coverage and the front yard setbacks, is completely compliant, and we are telling you that it's buildable.
I think we have the right to, at least I would say, I think we have the right to see that map.
You have a vesting tentative map before you. That is what we have. That is the only thing in the application.
Well, I think we have the right to, we have building envelopes here that are not compliant, and I think we have the right to see compliant building envelopes. Wouldn't you agree?
We are required to show you that it's buildable, and what we're telling you is that the building envelopes that were provided, they're coming back to you at design review. The building envelopes are not part of the map. Your city attorney has mentioned that. So what we've given you are samples, and what we're telling you is the map can be built as proposed.
So according to,
I disagree. If we're approving a vested map, I think under, maybe staff can elaborate. I believe if we're approving a vested map, we're approving the outlines of the buildings. Or maybe I'm wrong?
Let me read from section 19.623.120, which is the section on vesting tentative maps. Under item B sub 1B, intended development. The vesting tentative map application shall include accurately drawn preliminary floor plans and architectural elevations for all buildings and structures intended to be constructed on the property after subdivision. So it is requiring a higher standard than a regular tentative map. It is saying it has to have accurately drawn preliminary floor plans.
I agree. And then you guys have come back with some things that you might want changed. The vesting tentative map snaps the lines. And your council has explained that what most cities ask for is a fit guide. You want to see that we can in fact build something, that we're not creating lots that can't be built. And what we're telling you is the lots can be built. And what we provided to staff shows staff that under the objective standards of the code, the lots can be built. And it may require, as Commissioner Cribb mentioned, that we take out some small amount, 1,500 square feet, I think is the number he had come up with, not doing the exact math, over the entirety of the project in order to meet what may be larger setbacks. And all of that is entirely possible in design review, and what we're telling you is under the objective criteria of the code as it exists right now, the general plan and the zoning code, and using as samples the vesting tentative application information that we provided to you with building envelopes, with minor modifications, we can make these lots buildable.
So I disagree. The municipal code, as the chair just said, this shall include accurately drawn floor plans and architectural elevations for all buildings and structures intended to be constructed on the property.
Preliminary, I think, is the key word in there as well.
But they're not accurately drawn.
I'd say
They're accurately drawn.
They're preliminary for the final feedback and conditions to be further considered during the design and application process.
Well, there are 4 lots that are over 60% that I assume are going to have to, the floor plans are going to have to change.
The preliminary floor plans that are currently accurate, those preliminary floor plans may change a little. That is absolutely correct, and that is
But those
totally
preliminary
appropriate.
floor plans do not comply, and for findings for approval, it says the commission must determine that the development is consistent with the zoning regulations.
But the building footprints, and this is where I need your city attorney to answer the question, the building footprints are not snapped as part of the map. All we're asking for is a tentative map that snaps the lines for the property lines for the lots. It's not snapping the lines for the building footprint. So perhaps staff can answer that question for you so you feel assured that I'm not misrepresenting.
I think there's a lot of room for debate in that, and good attorneys can always argue both sides of everything, right, Veronica?
Generally true.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, however, I will agree that you are approving a map tonight and the parcel lines on that map. You aren't approving, again, with the conditions of approval, and your subdivision ordinance does allow for you to impose, and literally states within the subdivision ordinance, that required conditions shall secure compliance with the requirements of the development code and the general plan. So your subdivision ordinance does contemplate that if you have a concern about compliance, you can secure it through the conditions of approval. I'm not saying that means all of you are comfortable with the information in front of you. That's something you each have to address relative to this particular project. But I am saying that conditions of approval are in accordance with your code an appropriate way to address code compliance relative to things such as setback and coverage.
And another way could be just to have an accurate map.
Well,
Correct.
again,
The map is accurate.
I'm
With the
not
building
hearing from the
envelopes.
commission the map is inaccurate. I'm hearing from the commission your concern about whether or not you have sufficient information in front of you to determine whether buildings can fit on those lots. That's, I think, what I'm hearing.
Well, that's the concern, right? And this says accurately drawn floor plans, preliminary floor plans.
Right. Again, I don't think that they were inaccurate when submitted. I think what you're hearing now is your commission is saying, we want you to comply with X, Y, and Z by amending those plans as they have been submitted before final design review. That can be an appropriate condition of approval for the commission to impose. But again, the commission needs to be assured relative to your own minds that it can, in fact, meet that condition of approval. I think the developer is saying, we will meet that condition of approval. If they don't, then they don't have design review. I mean, ultimately, the project can't be approved if it doesn't meet the condition. And by project at that point, I mean the subsequent entitlement.
Can I ask one question about a condition to be added? Because one of the other concerns that I have is after we're looking at front yard setbacks and whatnot and changing, my personal objective as a commission is to make sure we don't lose any accessory dwelling units. Would it also be within our purview to require that the map secure those so that the developer can't come back and say, well, we couldn't put this accessory dwelling unit here or there, so we eliminated those? Because to me, that's almost eliminating the only thing that I consider to be the affordable component of this project. Does it sound reasonable to you if our commission did finally approve this map tonight, that we condition it to also ensure that those don't get eliminated? I'd rather eliminate covered parking before eliminate it. You know what I'm saying?
Or you'd rather the home get smaller.
The covered parking isn't counting, right? The covered parking doesn't count toward coverage because it's in a detached garage. So I don't think you're looking at eliminating covered parking. And are the ADUs on top of the garages?
There's a few where the garages are attached.
Okay.
But I think you understand where I'm coming from, is that if we would lose a unit in lieu of reducing the size of a single-family home,
so
of
again,
an accessory dwelling unit.
Right. I think we'd have to look at the question of whether or not, and I can't answer this question, whether or not an imposition of such a condition related to the accessory dwelling units either A, renders the project as a whole infeasible or impossible to comply with the other condition relating to coverage. I can't answer that question.
So maybe I can swing that back to the applicant. I think you know where I'm going with, because that was the other part at the last meeting. My admiration and that I liked this project. I didn't want it to go away, and one of the main reasons why was because of the number of accessory dwelling units that are encompassed in this project. I think it makes it a much better project, something that you didn't have to do, but I just want to make sure that we're not going to lose those if you go back to the drawing board between now and say, oh, well, gee, it's more important for us to have those larger single-family homes, because that's going to be what is going to allow us to sell and make a profit off of it. And so, would you be willing to
Can I answer it in two parts?
Yes. Okay.
So the first part, just for setting the record straight, the duplex units as currently proposed for the affordable housing, workforce housing units, those will actually be deed restricted. 2 of them will be low, 2 of them will be moderate. I believe the way the AMI works out for those thresholds, the lows will sell for about $195, and I'll defer to Deb for that, but they're actually deed restricted affordable ownership.
No, I understand that we're not going to ever. That's kind of fixed in stone. But what I'm concerned about are the units that are not deed restricted, because that really, in my mind, really makes this a stellar subdivision, because not every subdivision comes with an accessory dwelling unit, and there's multiple. There's 12. To me, that's really a valuable and key component of the subdivision. I want our commission to feel comfortable if we were to approve a vesting tentative map that at the end of the day, you're looking at coverage and setbacks, that you don't make the decision to eliminate one of those because you're trying to comply with coverage.
So if the commission would support the previous proposal where I had my little blue doodle over the entryways for the private alley off of Hayes and 4th Street, you can keep all 12.
You can keep all 12.
If you guys would be okay with that, we'll come up with another home plan, but I do agree with you that it would add to the community benefit. We can keep 12.
And could we write a condition to that effect if we were to approve this, that when a final map came back with a design review, that those units would still be there?
It might be on different lots, but.
Right, but still.
Yes.
To the extent that the developer is representing to the commission at this point that such a condition would not render the development infeasible and it can be met, then yes.
Okay, thank you.
So in terms of process, we would be approving a vesting tentative map tonight based on a blue doodle.
It would include a condition
Well,
of
I'm
approval
just
that
saying,
specifies.
I mean, I don't understand what the issue is in terms of creating a proper vesting tentative map. I mean, we're now being asked to add 4 new parcels to this, or whatever they would be. What would they be called? I'm blanking on the term.
Common area parcel.
You're talking about the common area.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally changing the vesting tentative map, not from the building envelopes, from the actual map. And I just, I'm one vote, but I'm not comfortable with this process.
And I understand that, Commissioner Barnett, but it sounds like your mind is made up, but I just close on, it's not a substantive change, it's just a technical change. We're sacrificing FAR for the site coverage by doing so, and it's just simply another line on a future final map. Still a whole private alley maintained by an HOA with CC&Rs in place, that's not changing, it's just putting a couple extra lines to show that, so.
Which, no, I understand what it is, we just don't have it in front of us.
I see that we have 2 choices here. And I think the most important thing about this project is the housing. We need housing. It's been determined by the governor that we need housing, and he is doing everything he can to provide legislation to make sure that we have housing. So we have 2 choices. One, as a commission, we can sit up here and help an applicant provide us housing and take the time to provide solutions and come up with reasons why. Or we can take the negative approach and find reasons not to. Either or. Help the applicant build us housing or find reasons not to. End of the story.
Well, I would argue that there's a third approach. We could help the applicant to create a better project that might take a little, a couple weeks, and create housing and be positive about it, which is all I'm asking. And I would note that the applicant, they were approved to build an apartment project behind Sonoma Market, about 16 months ago, and that hasn't started yet. So I'm saying, if it takes an extra few weeks to just get the project, just to create a good precedent, I don't understand why that's so offensive.
Couple comments just to make sure that I understood what I was hearing. The blue doodle is black on my drawing, so I just want to make sure I understand the right doodle. And that basically is talking about creating the common lot that would then adjust some of the coverage issues, correct?
If I may approach.
No problem. Got it. Blue, done. Back, you were going to say something before?
I was going to ask for a point of clarification, I think, just to make sure that the commission understood what is being proposed and maybe, so the street, what is shown on the original plan as a street private is not differing on the, well, calling it the blue doodle, for lack of a better word, with one exception, and that exception is ownership of a street private. As proposed in the original, the adjacent properties, lots 4 and 5, if we're talking about A Street North, no, that's not north, but whatever.
We got
You've got me.
Yeah.
Lots 4 and 5 abutting it would have owned to the center line of that same street. In the proposal before you now, the change that the applicant is suggesting, that street will, this is phrased as a question, though it does not sound like one, is going to be the same width and configuration. So that was a yes from the applicant. However, would be a separate parcel owned by the HOA. Same is true of the, I'm going to call it lower half of A Street, where it abuts lots 14 and 15. B Street, which is the center street that runs in between, is still proposed, this is also posed as a question, to be a part of its abutting parcels in terms of ownership and would not be an HOA-owned street, yes or no?
Not HOA owned, but reciprocal access easements maintained still by the HOA in the future governing documents and CC&Rs and budgeting for the Bureau of Real Estate.
So there is the answer to that question in very precise terms. So you have those indicated, the areas indicated on the map. What you, and you've heard that it's an ownership question relative to those particular areas. That is the difference between the originally submitted and what is being proposed as part of the application this evening.
You had suggested an additional condition of approval that would add these 2 parcels. Would that condition, would you be willing to have that condition of approval also add the preservation of the 12 ADUs?
Yes, sir.
Back to a question, Trent, if I could. Would there be any disadvantage of going ahead and making Street B the same as you would Street A in terms of it being HOA common space rather than lumping it into each of the adjacent lots and then having a reciprocal easement?
If we got rid of it through the rest of what is labeled as B Street, going down the middle for the main spine, if you will, all the FAR will be compromised for the rest of the lots, and it would be completely new plans.
So back to my original comments, if we're now talking about the Blue Doodle and based upon the interpretation by council, I believe that the drawings were accurately drawn. They just didn't reflect the exact percentage cover. And if we can condition that, then I'm okay going forward unless I'm missing out on something else in terms of not complying.
So in your light, are you saying that condition 14 takes care of that?
Let me go back and just glance at it one more time. This is the revised final.
Specifically, item F, 14F.
Why am I in this? 14F, site collection. I believe so. So what I've heard was that there is a need to manipulate the footprints in order to get the coverage under the requirement. Mm-hmm. And council would, state council, do you agree with the interpretation that this vested map is just snapping the property lines? Or the lot lines, I should say?
So I want to look at the conditions of approval because I think that preceding we had proposed a condition when the thought was that coverage met as long as they were inside the building envelopes that required or spoke to the suggested building envelopes. Assuming that there is no such condition, or if there is, we take it away, then yes, provided the commission feels that it has adequate information to ensure that the lots are buildable and that the information that you've received in the packet is sufficient relative to the vesting tentative map application. The only thing you are approving in this application is the lot lines and the conditions of approval that dictate what has to happen at design review.
Thank you.
I have a question, Chair, for Veronica.
Yes.
Would you say that creating these new parcels to get away from the site coverage restriction satisfies the spirit and the intent of the code?
Well, ultimately, that's a policy question for the commission to determine. I can certainly say that it is commonplace for internal, non-public streets, private streets, to be HOA owned and maintained on separate parcels. That's
in Sonoma? Because it says site coverage specifically says areas necessary for ingress and egress, which you would argue these driveways are necessary for ingress, egress.
So for this project, it's not a driveway. I mean, and it kind of never was. The coverage issue, again, speaks to on a lot-by-lot basis, not the project as a whole. And I don't believe was ever intended to address common area parcels where the roadway, for lack of a better word, as opposed to the driveway, the internal private streets. Every street is 100% coverage, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned. And frankly, we have other subdivisions where we have private streets that obviously the street itself doesn't meet a coverage requirement. So in that regard, I think it meets code.
But it's, well, okay.
Is it a driveway or a private road?
It's a private road as proposed. It is not providing individualized access to the parcel itself, which is what a driveway is. We can look up the definition in the code.
Because the prior explanation was it was a private driveway back in December.
It's an alley.
It's an alley. It's so an alley, private drive. It is not. It's not a driveway.
I would
And
defer
if it's
to the
conditioned, it will continue to not be a driveway.
It is a private alley for the sole benefit of the future residents of this community.
Okay, and it will be recorded as such.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, no one can do anything with it after the fact.
So, Mr. Chair, I do have some proposed language that I'll just put out there for a moment. This will be a new condition number 51, and I just want to try to throw something against the wall to see if it sticks. And that will be that the VTSM shall be modified to include lots to be dedicated to an HOA for a private alley adjoining lots 4 and 5 and 14 and 15 per Exhibit A, which I'll call the revised doodle diagram, to the VTSM that was submitted to the Planning Commission on 22nd of January 2019. That's my first thought, and we can have Veronica kind of respond to that if that's going in the
And I
direction.
believe the developer was willing to accept the addition of maintaining the same number of ADUs as part of that.
That was going to be condition number 52,
okay.
Which is the VTSM shall include a minimum of 12 ADUs.
Glad you're happy. Where do we go from here, Commission?
There was one extra thing that had to do with the changes, and there was a discussion and an explanation with changes to the actual parking lot and the berm, and so shaving it down so there's a transition between that and the lots that are to be created. Is it appropriate at this point to condition the vesting tentative map to require that the applicant address this as part of the design review for the
Sure. You can look at condition number 14. We've added as much, and I think we added language in there, including but not be limited to the following.
Because there'll be separate parcels after, if we were to approve this, they'll be
Yeah, we've got,
separated.
in condition number 14, you can see the last sentence that says, "The final design review shall address the final details of the project site design, architecture, landscaping." So that would include that component, I believe.
So when you're looking at landscaping and project, when the properties are re-subdivided, you're still looking at the parking lot still. So we can assume that we can condition the parking lot to make changes to the berm and the landscaping.
I believe so, yes. You will have the ability to do all landscaping on this particular site where these new lots are. And you will be doing that knowing what's on the other side of the fence or property line.
I don't feel like my question was answered. What I want to do is make sure that we can approve the vesting tentative map. So as a commission, we have the discretion of making changes on the hospital parking lot if we wanted to make changes to the berm and the landscaping. So there's compatibility between what we're approving.
So that one's a little quirky because it's an off-site improvement. Well, is it?
Right now, it's not. It's
You're
part of the
right.
project.
It's not because the parking lot is part of the application, and
Exactly.
it's the, for lack of a better word, remainder lot as part of the application.
Right. I just want some
So-
assurance that we can do that.
So as the parking lot is part of the application and severing, it's part of the project description total, yes, you can impose that condition.
Would it be
Re-
would it be cumbersome
Remember, the
to, like-
hospital's part of the applicant.
Right.
Right.
Would it be
So
right,
yes.
but would it be okay to like add specific, because I that's one of the things that I want to do is I want to be able to work through the design review if I'm given the opportunity to, is to make sure that there's a landscaping plan that addresses both off-site and on-site, and the cooperation would be somehow created by a condition of the vesting map.
Okay. Are you defining off-site to mean
The parking
the
lot.
parking lot?
Yes.
So that's still technically for the map's purposes on-site. Just
Right.
I'm drawing that distinction for a reason because it's part of the project as proposed. To the extent that you are saying you would like a condition that says the landscape plan shall include plans for the transition of the berm from the parking lot to the boundary of Lot 9, I think that condition could be imposed, yes.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that, okay.
I have a question. Are these, the doodle, is that, it says here, written, these are new separate parcels owned by the HOA. Isn't there a minimum 5,000 square foot lot size in this district?
That's why I asked the question if those have to comply with the zoning, like in terms of minimal width or square footage.
And the answer, and why doesn't it have to?
It's not typical for it to have to be a lot. Again, it is a common area parcel. It's not a lot. It's not a buildable lot. It is merely a common area parcel for the purposes of constructing the alley. And again, in a common interest development, that is standard.
And it's conditioned to be recorded as such.
And that is correct.
That's why I asked if it could be sold off separately, and you're saying it can't.
It cannot.
So hopefully that addresses
And
Commissioner
again,
Barnett's concerns.
did we address, I was looking at something else during the reading of condition 51, but it should say as a private alley on a common area parcel.
Since we're on conditions, is there anything else that any of the commissioners want to add or change to the conditions for approval? If there are not, I would like for us to now engage in a discussion on whether we want to move ahead on a resolution for the exemption.
I move that we move ahead on the exemption.
We have to phrase that a little differently.
Okay.
Interrupting for one moment for the purposes of helping craft the motion. The motion would be to approve the resolution, get the title.
2-1-219. Is it 2 or 1?
So a resolution of the Planning Commission of the City of Sonoma approving
1-219.
Staff is worried about the number on the resolution. Why don't you
I
go
have
ahead
a
and read it
resolution
then?
here if you want me to read it.
That would be fine, thank you.
It's a resolution of the Planning Commission of the City of Sonoma approving the 15332 categorical exemption for the Vesting Tentative Subdivision Map at 853 4th Street West to subdivide a 4.87 acre lot into 18 lots. Would that now change to 20 lots?
As you can say 18 lots and 2 common area parcels,
Okay.
but with regard to the question of the resolution, it should be as revised
Yes.
on today's date.
As revised on today's date with the conditions of approval as discussed and consented to by the commission.
And one more request from my perspective, if the commission will indulge. The CEQA resolution should be subject to the conditions of approval addressing themselves to the requirement to indemnify the city relative to any challenges to that document. And those are contained as condition number 4 of the conditions of approval. And I would request that the commission add condition 4 to the CEQA resolution.
Can I make a few changes or corrections? I believe under the general plan section, under intensity, I believe the maximum height limit is 30 feet, which this project complies with, but it's not 35. It says 35 there. 5.
I think the general plan actually says 35, but the zoning code is 30, but I can double check.
Where are we at?
In the Central West planning area, it's 30.
Zoning code, I think the general plan is the 35, but I'll double check.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Barnett, what are we looking at?
It's it doesn't really apply because the project. Okay, well maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. Then the other one is this a notice of determination or a notice of exemption?
Sorry, it will be an NOE.
Okay, well it says determination currently, so.
We can change that. And just a point of clarification, I think there was a motion, but we'd also need to include a condition number 53 for the record, that we were talking about the conditions of approval.
They're on the CEQA resolution, not
But were we not tying the conditions into the CEQA resolution, I think?
not all of them. No.
Okay, but as it relates to the modification of the alley, the language that I read in, and the VTS, the ADUs, and then the last condition about the landscaping transition, I haven't given you language for that piece yet. So to the degree that you want to have some language, I can throw something out to see if it does.
Now, let's make sure we get all the conditions nailed down, and the resolution does refer to conditions of approval for all these items for going into design review. So unless the city attorney wants something specifically included in the resolution, the body of the resolution, the rest of them, I believe, can stay in the list of conditions of approval.
Let me just read 51 through 54, and we can see if we're in love with them or not. And if Veronica wants to not have them there, that's great too, but if it's appropriate because they are customized, then we can defer to her expertise. So again, condition number 51 will be modified with the comments that we just heard from Veronica, and I'll see if I can put that in here. So basically 51 will say the vesting tentative subdivision map shall be modified to include lots to be added to be dedicated to an HOA for a private alley on a common area parcel adjoining lots 4 and 5 and 14 and 15 per Exhibit A to the VTSM, subject to the submittal on January 22nd, 2019. 52 would be the VTSM shall include a minimum of 12 ADUs. 53 is something I just dreamt up, so please feel free to modify it, but it's words to the effect of that the final map and perhaps the improvement plan shall show a transition between the existing parking lot and lots 9 and 10, which will be determined also through the design review process. I'm not sure about that.
It's just subject to final subject to design review by the commission.
Okay. I think I'm going to need some help from Veronica on that one because we're talking about a final map, excuse me, a condition that will be changed. Wait a minute. No, that could work. So in other words, the transition could be addressed through the design review, HPC, and then subsequent to that, the final map and the improvement plans will be prepared. You might want to just get consent of the developer on that he understands that's where you're heading. Yeah. And then the last condition will be number 54, adding the indemnification of condition number 4 that's in the conditions of approval to this particular SEQR resolution.
Does that have to be a condition?
It's probably not a condition, is it?
It's in the conditions already.
I'm being a bit of a stickler here, so I would like to see the same condition appear in the CEQA resolution relative to the indemnity and time limitations.
I have no problem with that, but I don't think it has to be listed as a condition number 54 in the conditions of approval.
No.
It's already in there as
No, it
condition
does
number
not.
4.
It's just, all you have to do is say you are approving the CEQA resolution with condition number 4 added.
In the motion.
Correct.
Okay.
But did we address correctly the condition number 53 that's not in the CEQA resolution relative to the landscaping transition?
Yes. There's one extra thing, and because I don't know if this is going to have to be handled off-site or on-site, because now we're talking about off-site landscaping, adding conditions. There's something in our zoning code about parking lots, 19.48.090, parking lot adjacent to residential uses. This is in the zoning code. It says you have to have a solid masonry wall or wooden fence, and that trees are needed to be provided at a rate of 1 for each 30 linear feet of landscaped area. So based on the length of the subdivision, we'd need a minimum of 7 trees to comply with the development code. We're looking at, we don't know what the setbacks are finally for the houses, but can we either A, feel comfortable that we could put those trees on the the lots 9 and 10, or whether or not we have the ability at our discretion to require those trees off-site to make sure that in the spirit of the zoning code we're making that meeting that condition, that requirement for development next to a parking lot.
Yeah, I may not be adding any greater light on this, but it would seem to me that the development code's talking about situations where you're creating a parking lot with a structure in a commercial zone that happens to be adjacent to residential. This is an existing parking lot where you're actually bringing residential to a property, right? So it's almost the reverse.
Yes and no. It's like we're still creating the situation. So it's all just happening at the same time. So I think that we still are going to be looking at the design review process screening. And I guess just my question is whether or not we could, if we don't have the room for those trees and the side yard setbacks, whether or not we have the discretion to require those trees off-site.
Well, I'm still struggling with the on versus off site. So let me try a different approach to that. Are you asking the question of if you want to impose a condition that adds trees on the what will be a new property line between the parking lot and the residential subdivision, and you're asking, can you require them to be on either side of the fence? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the question would be to the applicant and through the applicant who happens to be standing at the podium to the hospital applicant, can trees be planted on the other side of the fence?
In principle, no issue with the trees. In functionality, the parking lot's C3 runoff treatment is actually what that boundary is between our proposed development and the parking lot as well. So we can't really plant trees on their side of the fence line because it would compromise what's already there for taking care of all their water runoff. But I have no issues with meeting those requirements on our side of the property line and fence. I'm fine with the principle of screening with trees.
So when we come back in the future through design review, and we ask that that standard be met, do we feel comfortable that we can do that? I'm hearing the applicant say we can, and then we have a landscape architect here. I'm trying to figure out a way to be able to approve the map and not create hiccups down the road when we're doing design review.
I think it just be handled in design review, that it should be a screening requirement, and then we can just see how the applicant addresses it. And I think,
So,
yeah.
I apologize. I think it would be wise at this point to go ahead and add that as another condition. So if the commission as a whole is concerned relative to the screening between the parking lot and the I'll call them home site area because I don't know what else to call it, then I think you should add that as a condition now.
I'd like to add that as a condition now then.
Okay. That would be new condition K on number 14. We could put some language in there that's saying the location of landscape, the creation of a landscaping buffer between the parking lot and home site areas. Her language.
I have to go back to Commissioner Corrado and see if you're still willing to make the motion for the way that it has been stated by staff and whoever as your motion.
I am.
Okay. This motion needs a second.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a second. Any further discussion? I'll ask for a roll call vote, please. Are we waiting for anything?
We're waiting for the city engineer to have some input, and I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to affect everyone. So the city engineer had been listening closely to the planning director's recitation of condition 51 and therefore wanted a clarification to that condition, and I'll have the planning director read that clarification.
New condition number 51. The VTSM shall be modified to include common area parcels to be dedicated to an HOA for a private alley joining lots 4, 5, and 14 and 15 per Exhibit A to the VTSM submitted to the Planning Commission on January 22nd, 2019. Fergie, that okay? Thanks, that looks like it's going to work.
Is that still satisfied for your motion and your second?
I'm fine.
Any discussion? I will call for a roll call vote.
Commissioner Barnett?
No.
Commissioner Corrado?
Yes.
Commissioner Willander?
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar?
No.
Commissioner McDonald?
No.
Commissioner Cribb?
Yes.
Chair Felder?
No. Commission, it failed
Failed.
3-4. Correct?
That is correct.
And I want to clarify my my vote. I think that we have been pushed into a list of ever-growing conditions and doodle maps that are rather incomplete information to be dealt with short notice. And I would like to see us continue this item so that the proper map can be prepared for us, and we can have a final list of conditions that the public has had a chance to look at, so that we are making sure that we have done all of the appropriate things to do this thing in an orderly fashion rather than being rushed to judgment. So I think that what I'm looking for is someone to make a motion to continue the item so that the developer has a chance to come back with everything that's been discussed here tonight and to present us with what he believes the vested tentative map should be. And we have all the documentation in front of us so that we can properly make a determination.
Before we make a motion, could I ask through the chair a question of the applicant?
Yeah.
If one of us were to make a recommendation to continue to a date certain, do you feel that you have enough information from us to come back with us to make revisions to a vesting tentative map that we as a commission might be able to approve at our next meeting in February?
So I would, as it was mentioned before, I think because there's so much history now with this being our third hearing with this body of the commission, would the commission be willing to have another special meeting before the final turnover with planning commission? If not, then I would honestly prefer to appeal the no vote to the city council.
I don't have a problem meeting before the 20th, personally.
Because I can address everything and put it all in clean fashion, because I do recognize this blue pen is not as crisp and clean as the clean lines on a CAD file. And I'd be happy to make those adjustments and already have all these 54 new conditions in place to come back to you before the new commission is in place, because I would really like to try to finish it with you all. Otherwise, I would prefer to take it to the next level.
Mr. Chair, if I can just add some timing issues here. Your commission changes over on the 1st of February, so you would need, if this commission wants to sit, it would need to do that between now and the 1st of February. Our next meeting, just for your information, is February 21st, not the 14th. That'll be your next regularly scheduled meeting, so you can continue this regular meeting to that regular meeting. Or you can create a special before the 21st, post the 1st.
So the last opportunity we would have to meet with this current commission is Thursday, January 31st.
And we can't go past midnight.
I think it would be a very quick one after hearing all the feedback tonight and the conditions that were agreed upon, and if it's just presenting it in a clean and confirmed fashion, I can adjust that 2-foot front setback, show the site coverage, and I will show building envelopes of what can be for those new lots that we're changing with the common area parcels that were discussed. I can show all that to you next week. I can have that all back to staff by the end of this week.
So, Mr. Chair, looking at the calendar, I'm not sure about any magic between meeting on the following Tuesday, week from tonight. We have through Thursday the 31st, which could also work depending on your calendars. I prefer to have the applicant spend the right amount of time. I do know that I think Commissioner McDonald's out of town, though. Is that correct, Bob?
That's correct.
And also Tuesday is the celebration of the, city artist. at the community center.
Well, I would propose Thursday as the 31st. I would like to ask Commissioner Barnett if the developer came back with what you felt was an appropriate representation of the tentative map, the vesting tentative map, if that would give you enough information to take the, or is that enough time to consider the request?
Yeah. I mean, the CEQA exemption is a different question than the tentative map, but yes.
Okay. And we would still, on the 31st, we would still have to take up the resolution for the tentative map.
That'll be the CEQA resolution and the resolution on the map.
Both, but.
Wait. We just, correct.
Yeah.
So why don't we just continue the hearing, but continue the vote on the CEQA exemption?
You would be.
Well,
by default,
you've taken
because
no
one
action.
else has made another motion.
There's no action at present, right? So
Yeah,
it'll
right.
continue to the next meeting.
And we would have time, city staff, to get this information out to the public as a noticed, well, as a scheduled meeting. Go ahead.
We would need to create a packet for on the 25th, Friday the 25th, to get it out for public review as we normally do for a Thursday evening meeting. So the applicant's really got a short fuse. He's got maybe, 2.5 days to put it together.
So I just want to make a point, and this isn't the city's fault, it's just the way the process works. When we continue meetings, the neighborhood is not notified, because the neighborhood is only notified during the first meeting. And so that's just a discussion for the future. I mean, that's all complying with state law, by the way. It's just, I don't know if the neighborhood even knows this meeting's going on right now. Number one. Number two, I would be okay with, have we made all the points we want to make about this map? Because, obviously it would be, good to get all those points out before.
Well, I would want us to take the time to make sure that everything that we want to discuss has been discussed tonight, so the applicant has the opportunity to turn this around in a couple of days and present us with the full package.
I would also like to require, and I know that, I don't know if we can do this, but that everything is in on Friday, because I don't want to have all this stuff handed out at the meeting again.
Yeah, that would be a firm requirement, I think, for us to, if we make a motion to continue this, that part of that motion, I think, should have a stipulation that the packet is produced by Friday.
Well, I can guarantee you we'll get a packet to you on Friday. It's a matter of what it contains. I think the point being is you want to have no submittals after Friday.
Yes.
That modifies the packet in any
Yes.
way.
That's correct.
I think our directive has been very clear, and I think we can.
So, Mr. Chair, you would need a motion to continue to the 31st.
Is anybody willing to make that motion?
I'll move that we continue this meeting to January 31st, 6:30 p.m.
Second.
That's okay.
Roll call vote.
Commissioner Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner Corrado.
Aye.
Commissioner Willander.
Yes.
Commissioner Bohar.
I guess I would vote in favor of it. I'm going to be out of the country that week, rest of that week.
Commissioner McDonald.
Yes.
Commissioner Cribb.
Yes.
Chair Felder.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Does that mean we get another cake?
I will bring cookies this time.
You should get another cake.
Yes, I didn't think
We'll bring one for the commission that's not present tonight.
Actually, there still might be leftovers because they'll still be fresh.
Now, is there any other points that want to be made concerning the vesting tentative map by any of the commission so that the applicant has all of the information he needs to proceed?
Can I?
I mean, I made my points, but it seems like the commission is okay with the design of this map. And so it doesn't really matter.
Okay. Anybody else? It's the last chance. With that, I believe we will close this item then, and we will continue the meeting to January 31st.
I just want to close with one final remark, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I do realize this has felt very contentious, but I just want you all to know I do sincerely appreciate your guys' thoughtful time and consideration. As it was mentioned before, it's oftentimes a very thankless job being volunteer positions on the commission. The applicant appreciates it, the hospital appreciates it. I feel like we're getting into the spirit of collaborating to try to create housing, so I sincerely thank you all for your time.
Okay. And I want you to understand that it isn't that we're not trying to get the project approved. We want the project to be approved with everything in place to make sure that it's been adequately reviewed and we have the documents without last minute changes and doodles to work with.
Understood, 100%.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're not done yet.
I suppose it's going to be a rubber stamp meeting.
Do we have any issues update?
No, Mr. Chair, just to remind you about your first meeting in February, the 21st, as opposed to the 14th.
Okay. Then we move on to comments from the commission. And I was going to make a comment for our departing commissioners, but I'm going to hold that now till January 31st. I know. But I do have another comment. It was reported in the IT today that the city has looked at what is going on at MacArthur and Broadway in terms of the MacArthur Place remodel. And apparently that they're allowing that lot to be used for temporary storage of whatever materials. But I think that we need to have someone with authority from the city go out and take a look at what is being done there in terms of the way they're storing materials and for the period of time they're storing. They are dumping concrete and old toilets and other stuff at the gateway to our town. And at the very least, I think that the city should put a requirement to at least put screening on the fence, for heaven's sakes. Because I think it's, we talk about how it was an awful looking site, and it's only gotten significantly worse with the use of that property by MacArthur Place.
Can I add also to this, because this is something that concerns me. I believe, I might be mistaken, but there was a condition that's added, which is a planning, and I think it's a public works condition, that there is a plan that's supposed to be prepared by the developer for construction, employee parking, and that's supposed to be reviewed by the public works director and the planning director. And if that's what came out of that condition, then I think that was not adequately handled.
So there's a couple of things. Number one, there's the project. We'll certainly look into it and get back to you, Commission, at the next meeting. But what I can tell you is that there may be a condition on the remodeling site, as opposed to a temporary use permit that we the city granted prior to my arrival, I believe, for the 870 address to be a repository site for construction materials and storage while the hotel is going through its remodeling. The first question came to us when I drove through town and saw some trees being stored there, thinking that they might have been doing tree removal on the site, which was not the case. It was tree removal and storage of those stumps, if you will, from the hotel project, but we'll certainly get back to the commission on that.
Okay, because I don't recall anything being given as an approval during that remodel project to use that site as storage.
It was a subsequent temporary use permit issued by the planning department.
Okay.
Does the planning director have I know it wasn't you, but the authority to issue temporary use permits without commission approval?
Yes, sir. The way it works is that your code right now says that there's a certain variety, if you will, on the menu of use permits that are administratively issued, and the director has the discretion to remand it, is that the right word, or take it to the planning commission for his consideration to take it up to the commission. And that's been done on a few occasions, but not
So
on
they
this
do
one.
have a use permit to do that right now?
That is correct, yes.
Is there a time associated with that?
There was not one specified specifically, so that means the default of a year would be time period.
If there was a use permit granted, is it possible to be modified to add screening?
I guess to be a little bit tough about going into an existing permit. If it's in violation of something within the code, I can probably go talk to them, but I can also approach the hotel people because that would be something that would be a good neighbor kind of a thing to do.
And also, is there a way to just double check to make sure that there's not inconsistency with any conditions that were approved by our planning commission? And also, I don't believe that there was an environmental review. There was no initial study or mitigation measures.
So, Commission, I'm going to suggest that we bring this information back to you, and if the Commission would like to have it agendized, we can agendize it. But at this point, I think we're a little deep in the weeds here on the discussion. So I would like to suggest that we cut this off here, and staff will bring a report back to the Commission either in writing or at a future meeting.
Well, I've got one more thing.
Well, can we have that on January 31st?
Yeah, I'll just report back to the commission like we've done on so many other occasions on different topics.
So we can agendize that?
No, I'll just report back.
Okay, all right.
You want to agendize?
Okay.
Then we will agendize it.
Same issue, new issue?
No, new issue.
Can I add something to that last one?
Yeah, not to add on, but there was only one dissenting vote on allowing valet parking down there at the MacArthur Place. And since that was voted on, cars are still out in the road, and they're the employee parking all over the street, and the valet parking is not being enforced down there. And the parking is just as bad on the street as it was prior to our insisting that, and they're agreeing and offering that they could get all those cars off the street with valet parking. I'm sure the neighbors are unhappy about that.
We can agendize that too and report back.
Okay.
So, I've got another issue that I would like to bring to the forefront. I would like us to get on the agenda the zoning issues and create an ad hoc committee to go through the zoning code now that I don't have to do it. So I'd like to put that on the agenda.
Right now, staff is taking a look at that in two phases. The first phase is some, I don't want to call them emergency amendments, but I will call them urgency amendments or urgent amendments to address some of the issues that you've been really grappling with, just to get clarity, not necessarily to make policy changes. Subsequent to that, you obviously have a task in front of you to, I'll call it revamp or take some hard looks at the zoning code. I think the urgency items are probably shorter term and rather than committee related, if you will. But if the commission disagrees, then obviously we can agendize the question. Agendizing the question of moving forward with a committee to look at comprehensively the development code, I think is something that if the commission wants to put that on the agenda, I'll defer to the planning director about timing on that one.
Thank you. I would look for someone to make a motion to adjourn.
Oh, to adjourn. I don't have to make a motion to put it on the agenda?
I don't believe so.
Typically, the chair would entertain creating an ad hoc, and we can put that on the agenda to discuss it at the next meeting if you want. Or if that can wait until February 21st, that would be another suggestion.
I think we've got enough to take care of on the 31st. We want to make sure we're done before midnight, so I would rather defer that to the 21st of February.
But he did say February 21st.
Hmm?
He did say February 21st. That's all, never mind. I'm motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0.